Hi sword people! The other day I drove to Sebastian Wesche's place in order to team up with him and researcher Elias Flatscher to test some ideas that Elias has regarding sword beads. Now, sword beads were popular in Western Europe between the end of the 4th century and the end of the 6th century. It seems that they completely fell out of favor in the course of the 7th century. And as the name says, they're associated with swords. In the graves, they're found some 10 centimeters away from the hilt, but it's not clear whether they were attached to the scabbard or to the sword hilt. They come in all kinds of materials and shapes and sizes, and they could consist of, say, crystal, glass, amber. They all have a central hole that is drilled into the bead, and some of the finds indicate that a strap was attached to the bead, protruding vertically from it. As to the meaning and purpose, all kinds of ideas have been presented, but commonly researchers believe that they had some ritual or magical meaning. Now, Elias wanted to test some ideas regarding a practical function of sword beads, and I instantly had to think of a passage in Egil's Saga, which I'm going to read to you now. As soon as Egil could make out where Berg-Onund was, he pulled out his sword. There was a loop attached to the grip and around his hand, from which the sword hung. He took his spear in hand and ran forward to face Berg-Onund, who moved faster himself as soon as he saw this, holding his shield in front of him. Just before they met, each flung their spear at each other. Egil let his shield take the spear, holding it aslant so that a piece was sliced away. Then the spear fell to the ground. But Egil's spear struck Berg-Onund's shield right in the center and passed through it some way up the blade, so that it stuck firm in the shield. Berg-Onund began to find the shield heavy to carry and tried to draw his sword, but before he could pull it halfway out of the scabbard, Egil had run him through. So there are other examples for sword knots or loops attached to sword hilts in the Icelandic sagas. So we know that by the 13th century, a sword knot is not something that was considered unusual. Now, Elias is a martial artist himself. He's a Silat practitioner. He also is a wrestler, and he is aware of my research into sword hilt ergonomics and fine engine skills in sword fighting, and he was asking whether I would be willing to test some of his ideas. All we needed now was an appropriate spatha, a Merovingian spatha, and this is where Sebastian came into play. He replied to a request of Elias, which I shared on my internet platforms and in my newsletter. So finally we ended up meeting the other day, and as far as I'm concerned, I was most interested to see whether a sword knot would support or possibly even hinder those actions which I consider vital when fighting with sword and shield. So Elias came out with a number of variants of attaching a sword bead. There was one that I liked a lot, and that's the one that I'm going to share with you now. This is one of many possible ways to attach a sword bead by means of a simple leather string, in this case, to the hilt, and this is one of the systems or methods that Elias has suggested. And you could just simply grab this knot and grab the bead, and by tying it around your hand like so, you get additional support when you hold the sword. Now, specifically with spathas like that, one of the meanest hits is a strike to the leg. I found that if you use a sword like that, which is very top heavy but razor sharp, once you have created an opening underneath the opponent's shield, cutting works best if you just throw the sword forward and let it do the job for you. Now, one of the problems when you do that kind of cast blow, then all I have to make sure that I don't lose the sword is this little hook here from the pommel, from the
upper guard. And there are swords from that period that have even less of a pommel. With later early medieval swords, Viking Age swords, that's not a problem. But here it feels really convenient to have an additional safety strap on my hand, which secures the sword to my hand, so that when it flies out, I can use all the impact of the sword, I can use all the momentum of this sword, and it can cut in a way that's very appropriate to this kind of blade. But I also have a means of holding onto my sword, which means that I find this kind of strap is really, really good to secure the sword in my hand, and it makes utter sense to me. As you can see here, now the support of the strap is over the back of my hand. If I prefer to have the support only via the fingers, I can simply change to gripping the bead in this fashion. Now the support is only about over my fingers if I want this additional freedom. This is less support. It's still a good means of retrieving the sword when I do this kind of cut. Personally, I favor the first one more, and it's really nice. It also, and that's very important to me, it is in no way a hindrance when I deliver a tverhau. A tverhau, in my opinion, is the most appropriate blow in a context of sword and shield with that kind of weapon. So it's crucial to me that a tverhau is still possible with this kind of strap arrangement here, and absolutely yes it is. So I really like this one. We tried out a number of various systems, and I feel that in conjunction with the Sparta, this is absolutely fantastic. And what's even cooler, when you look at it in the scabbard and it hangs down, the spot in relation to the hilt is pretty much exactly like what we see in archaeological contexts. So, great idea, love it.
Note that any practical function of a sword bead would not rule out any magical associations with sword beads in the day. So why did sword beads fall out of favor in the course of the 7th century? There are all kinds of possible explanations. Maybe they were no longer considered fashionable, maybe magical beliefs associated with sword beads were no longer considered acceptable, but maybe there is some correlation between the development of sword hilts and sword beads. So the support provided by a sword bead or a sword knot respectively was now provided by newly designed shapes of sword hilts. If we take a look at sword pommels of the Carolingian era, the period that followed the Merovingian era, then you will note that pommels become bigger, and I found that when you strike a cast blow with a sword like that, then the long bottom side of such a pommel provides kind of a safety stop, a rest for the fingers, which prevents the sword from flying out of your hand. And with a pommel like that, you don't really need a sword bead or a sword knot that serves exactly the same purpose. This is just an idea, and it would require in-depth research into the various shapes of pommels of periods preceding the Carolingian era, but it's well worth examining. Now, all these aspects and a lot of in-depth information on sword beads and the development of sword knots in later periods will be discussed in the academic paper that Elias is preparing and which will appear later this year. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe to my newsletter because I will share it as soon as it comes out. Also, thanks a lot to my patrons who put me in a position that I can do this kind of research and I can go on excursions. If you want to support my work too, you're most welcome to join the community of patrons. Find a respective link in the captions. I hope you found this presentation interesting and useful and thought-provoking. Have a great day, keep a sword by your side, and see you next time.